Now, another form of an offline attack would be a brute force attack. And this is basically where we just try all possible words or any combination thereof. We're basically going to try everything we can think of. It is a very common form of attack, and it will succeed if we have a relatively weak password that has been used. Now, this can take a little more time because, after all, we're not just trying all the different kinds of words. In other words, we're not just trying apple and apricot and all normal words. We're trying things such as A and then lowercase aa and then uppercase aa. In other words, they're trying every possible combination there is. They're trying to brute force it. So typically what's going to happen with this kind of an attack is the first thing the hacker will try to do is gain access to the hash file. Once they're able to gain access to the hash file, instead of actually trying to log on and brute force your account that way, they're going to take the hashes contained within that file and they're going to run a brute force against those hashes to see if they can find the right combination of letters or numbers or characters that will actually produce the same hash result. So some of the considerations on this kind of attack are that it is very slow, but remember that they're going to try every possible combination. So eventually, it's only a matter of time before they can actually go back and get the password. They will crack the password. Now, NT-type hashing is much harder than an LM hash, but remember that a hash can still be cracked. The next kind of attack is a pre-computed hashes, and this is where you generate all possible hash values in advance, and then you simply store those in a database. Later on, you'll just simply do a comparison. You'll take the hash file, you'll compare that against the hash database, and when you find the two matches, voila, you have the password. Now, one of the reasons that this can be run offline, and most likely will be run offline, is because storing all of these different kind of hashes can take a humongous amount of space. In other words, for LM hashes, it can take up to 310 terabytes, and for NT hashes that are less than 15 characters, it can take many different, over in excess of 5 billion exabytes. So this can be a very, very processor and resource intensive method. But again, this can be very effective for the hacker. Now, non-technical attacks are attacks that we typically don't consider. Oh sure, we'll consider shoulder surfing or peeking over somebody's shoulder. We always make sure that there's nobody standing around, right? But there are other types of attacks that are non-technical that are just as effective. Now, somebody could do shoulder surfing, and some people do have the ability to actually look and watch what you're typing. And as soon as you type it, they know what you've typed. It is something that is more common than you might think, and that combined with the fact that most people will use bad passwords can be a very effective method. Sometimes just seeing the first couple of characters that are typed in is enough to trigger or enough for us to guess what that familiar password is. Another form of non-technical attack would be simply looking around the environment. How many times have we looked and found that underneath the keyboard the user has a sticky, and what's on the sticky? Of course, their password. Or let's say the system administrator has really done a good job of making sure they can't use any common passwords, so they've made sure everybody must have many characters and upper and lowercase and numbers and symbols. Well, a user can't remember all that. So sometimes what do? They'll actually take and just put a sticky on the side of the monitor. After all, how do we expect them to remember that? So shoulder surfing is more than just looking over the shoulder. Sometimes it's just walking by the cube or looking around or checking the desk drawer for any little bits of information or stickies that might be laying around that have words on them that don't seem to make sense. Another kind of non-technical attack is keyboard sniffing. Now, keyboard sniffing basically means that we've got some form of mechanism, maybe it's hardware, maybe it's software, that basically records everything that happens. Now, the hardware is relatively cheap, very inexpensive, and small and discreet. In fact, a lot of times, unless you're actually looking for it, you won't see it there, even though it'll be in plain sight. So that's the hardware end of it. But there are also a lot of different software that does the same thing. And this software can simply record all the activity that you do. It can record every keystroke that is entered into the system. And then, of course, later on, the hacker can examine these files of all this recorded information, and then they can go ahead and see exactly what it is you typed in. Another form of non-technical attack is social engineering. And we're going to get more into social engineering in one of our later modules. But suffice it to say that you can simply strike up a casual conversation as one of the many ways that you can get information out of a person and then possibly use that information to try to crack that person's password. So, what can you do instead of using passwords? Well, passwords are everywhere, but sometimes we need more protection than we can have with a simple username and password account. Two of the options that are available are smart cards. Now, smart cards basically require some form of a card with an electronic chip in it. In addition to that card, you also have to have a PIN, or sometimes it's also called a password. So not only do you have to know the username and you have to have access to the card, but you also have to have this PIN number or this other password. So this can be a little more difficult for a hacker to crack because they have to have physical access to the device itself. Now, one thing about smart cards, however, they are still at this point fairly expensive, and you have to have separate readers that can read this information off of the smart card in order for the smart card authentication to work. Another possible way you could get around using passwords by themselves would be to use biometrics. And there are all kinds of biometrics out there. Everything from fingerprint scanners to retinal scanners to all kinds of other biometric type devices. Again, normally this requires a user account with some kind of biometric validation as well as a password. However, this can be defeated as well. Now, typically this is very, very expensive, so you don't have a lot of organizations that have implemented biometric type security on the accounts. In addition, there is almost always a backup way to authenticate with the system. After all, if I have to do a fingerprint scan and I have burned my finger so my fingerprint is scarred or perhaps even bandaged, how do I get to use the system? So there are normally backup plans that have been implemented just in case the biometrics are not available for whatever reason. And of course then you can attack the backup plans to those biometrics to try to get around that biometric system. Now, anytime a company implements these kind of advanced security precautions, and even with a more simple security precaution, one of the best things you can do to help prevent people from accessing or using weak passwords or abusing their accounts is to make sure you have a strong account lockout or account abuse policy in place. Once you have this in place, you've let the users know just how important security is to your organization. And on the unfortunate event that somebody may compromise an account, you can take actions with that particular account. So make sure everybody understands what is the security policy. You can use any kind of policy you want, but make sure that it's well known to all of your employees.